Welcome to this panel on disinformation and our digital democracies. The events of January 6th demonstrated all too well that what happens online has real-world consequences. Across our democracies, we're seeing conspiracies spread about COVID, about elections, sometimes spread by authoritarian regimes, and these all serve to radicalize the population. In various summits this week, governments are acknowledging this proposals for future of tech, Trade and Technology Council, and various other initiatives that to safeguard the internet democracy. We have a distinguished panel here today. I couldn't think of a better group of people to discuss this challenge. We have Honorable Adam Kinzinger, who's a member of the House of Representatives from Illinois. Honorable Carolyn Dimage, Minister of State for Digital and Culture in the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, the UK. The Honorable Baiba Brasse, Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy, NATO, and here with me is Dr. Bruce Gellin, Chief of Global Health Strategy for the Rockefeller Foundation. I want to jump right into the discussion and ask, starting with Congressman Kinzinger, you each work in very different spheres, public health, national security, consumers, yet the organizations you lead are compelled to internet harms. Congressman, can you talk a little bit about the harms that you've seen and that you've tried to address?
Yeah, well, thank you. So, what we're noticing, as everybody is well aware, is how misinformation can be just, torn apart using the internet. And then, of course, we run into these difficulties in terms of, what role is the government? In the United States, of course, we have the First Amendment, the freedom of speech. So, where can the government step in that's not a violation of the First Amendment and freedom of speech? Well, one of the things I think we can look at within that context is, making consumers aware of where an app comes from, for instance. Where does it originate from? We have issues, of course, we understand with, Russia and China spreading disinformation, particularly in the United States and in the West. So if an app, for instance, is created in China or Russia, it should be something that's the consumers can look at and see and be aware of. The other question is, how do democracies work together in this process to say, okay, look, we do want to protect people's right to have an opinion, people's right to express that, because that's what differentiates us from some of these authoritarian regimes. But they also can understand how to exploit that. We see that through conspiracy, through, all the things that we saw, for instance, leading up to January 6th here. So we have a number of initiatives out in Congress, but I'm going to tell you the problem is when you get down to the nitty gritty of how to implement things, there's always going to be disagreements within parties, going to be disagreements among allies. But I think what's very important for us in really free countries that want to maintain that freedom of opinion is to say, how do we do this together in a way that pushes back, but also can protect this this freedom that we all have, and that's why I think this conversation today is very important to not just begin to have this, because a lot of times in political circles we say we're going to begin to have a conversation, but I think to actually begin the process of addressing this and fixing it, and most importantly, making people aware of how they're targeted through things like social media, new media, et cetera.
Very much, and since you didn't hear me before, I'll just repeat that I think what's so great about this panel is that we have people from very different spheres, all talking about the harms, different kinds of harms they see, and different ways to address them. And I hope at the end of the panel, we can very briefly talk about how we might learn from each other's efforts and build to scale. But Minister, the UK is really leading with some very innovative proposals. But before we get into those, I would love to hear what harms it is that you are addressing and that you're seeing, that your proposals are meant to address.
So thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. Really, really pleased to take part. I mean, I suppose it goes back, as the UK's Minister of State for Digital, I've been working really, really closely with partners throughout the pandemic to deliver a really kind of coordinated response to the new challenges that COVID-19 has presented in terms of misinformation and disinformation. So we were looking at this for a really long time, of course, before that, along in our online safety legislation. But but COVID has brought everything into a really, really sharp focus. And right from day one, we've seen a range of baseless narratives being shared about vaccines, about false cures, and even sort of obscure things like links to 5G masks and coronavirus. And the reason this is important is that I remember, so my oldest child is now nearly 19, and I remember back in the early 2000s when he was a small baby, there was a misinformation circling in the UK about the measles, mumps and rubella vaccine, and that there was a suggested link to autism. And those were in the days when the internet was in its infancy, really. So mostly this information was being spread by word of mouth and in newspapers. But at that time, I remember how confusing I found it. This false information and the rate at which it spread was hugely unsettling. And as a first-time mum, you want to be able to do something to find out and get access to accurate information. So I suppose what has been the driving force behind everything that we've been doing is access to accurate information. It's a key part of our democracy, and actually, in attempting to stop people accessing information that can restrict freedom of expression. It can restrict people's ability to be able to interact in daily life with all the stuff that we care about. So this is why it's important. And so very much our approach has been one of reassurance, giving people access to legitimate information. So rebutting the incorrect information, reassuring them with valid and reliable sources of information, and then where necessary, working with platforms to remove items which are harmful, and there's no other way to deal with them.
Thank you so much. And we'll talk more about the vaccine conspiracies with Dr. Gillen. But first, I wanted to ask Assistant Secretary General, maybe I'm going to put this up so make sure you can hear. Can you hear better? Okay. Maybe you can, Assistant Secretary General, can you talk to us about the national security component of all this? We've heard about what happens to individuals, and we think about political polarization in the U.S. a lot, but this conversation really started with foreign interference in many countries.
Hi, and good afternoon from Brussels, where we just completed a very successful NATO summit yesterday, as you all saw, with President Biden and 29 other leaders all together reconfirming our very strong transatlantic bond. So we are very much looking forward to continue this work and bring NATO into the future, called NATO 2030 decision package. And how does NATO come into this very valid discussion on disinformation and countering it? Or what do we mean with that? Is that, of course, NATO is a military political alliance, military alliance, and our three core tasks are to ensure that our 1 billion citizens are protected against all threats, so collective defense, crisis management, including such crises as pandemics and similar, and also cooperative security, or assisting our partners and working with our partners. And obviously the information dimension is both a political and military, so civilian and military part of the whole equation. So in that respect, indeed, NATO also has made decisions to adjust for the future, because with the emerging and disruptive technologies taking over also the information, and as we heard, and as we all know, it has completely changed how we communicate, how we receive information, how we process and how we distribute information. NATO indeed also has recognized that it is the whole society approach that is needed through building resilience. And what that means for us is to enable this defense and deterrence, we also need strong societies and private sector. So very clearly, the private sector plays a role, both in terms of engaging with NATO, with allies, with other democracies, taking on more responsibilities, understanding that prosperity does depend on security, so having the reliable dialogue, but also making sure excuse me, that the sort of resilience baselines or ability for our democracies to function during the crisis or recover from the crisis or shocks, they do depend also on the private sector, be it on critical infrastructure, be it on transport, logistics, and quite a number of other things, but especially also in the information field.
Great, great,
Then,
thank you. Okay,
of
if we
course,
can,
when
let's
we
go to
look,
Bruce, and then we can talk about more solutions and go around. But I wanted to give Dr. Gellin the opportunity to talk, especially, Minister Dinenage was talking about 19 years ago seeing anti-vax conspiracy theories. What's different now? What's really changed so that it's become such a widespread concern?
So can you hear? We can hear each other. Can you hear me? No. Yes. Better? I'll try that. I'm sure. Okay. I think that. So if I didn't know better, you think the minister and I rehearsed this, because I've been doing global and public health and specifically for 25 years, and what in some ways it might be an inflection point, because there was a very active effort by a fringe movement to raise issues about a vaccine to generalize to other vaccines that then question science more generally. And what's different now is clearly the volume and the ability for people to connect from anywhere, and a problem anywhere is instantly seen somewhere else. A rumor that starts in France is instantly across the microphone, and people don't know where to turn for information. So that's the issue of time. Protection of infectious diseases and misinformation and disinformation in many places. So as the minister mentioned, we saw it with routine stations, we saw it in Ebola and the Congo, and we're clearly seeing this in a huge fashion now with COVID. Everything from the virus to the vaccine to the plots that people have. And so as far as harms go, when it comes to health, harms turn into lives. And that's why this is so important, because this is not just something that's interesting. When people make bad decisions based on bad and intentionally bad information, bad things will happen.
Minister, I wanted you to pick up, and if you could tell us a little bit about the UK's online safety bill. I know there's been robust conversation about it in the UK, but it's not as well known elsewhere, and we'd be really interested.
Absolutely, yes. I'm very happy to do this. So we brought forward this online safety bill. It's a very large piece of legislation. It's quite groundbreaking, and it's basically a new framework which will give large digital businesses the kind of rules of the road to follow, so that we can seize the brilliance of modern technology to improve our lives, but also keep people, particularly children and vulnerable people, safe from the more unsavory parts of the online world. It's going to have very robust and proportionate measures to deal with misinformation and disinformation, to the extent that it could cause significant physical or psychological harm to an individual. So things like anti-vaccination content and falsehoods about COVID-19 could very well apply. We're appointing a regulator to enforce the laws, and the legislation will give them the tools to understand the threats that are out there, to set a very clear duty of care to the platforms, and then to take action if necessary.
Minister, did you have more to say?
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, I think it's really important that the legislative measures, work on so many different levels. They've got to uphold and protect freedom of expression online as well. So it's got to make sure that we've got a really proportionate approach to manage risks, but also to ensure that those protections for freedom of speech and expression are maintained.
Congressman, I'm going to give you a chance to see if you enter into the echo zone as well. You proposed some specific legislation, and I think the kinds of solutions you were talking about have to do with the manipulation that happens online. And I wonder if you could talk about those.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, I've got a number of pieces of legislation out there. Some of them is dealing with, when it comes to manipulation against both, how to find people, how to use people, how to search them, how to target them, but also when it comes to people that are defrauded. So for instance, I had my picture stolen a number of times and used because I'm also a military officer, a military pilot, and used through what are called these romance scams, and where they target people and, you know, get all their money from them. I mean, for literally a period of about 8 years, I'd have a number of women that would come forward, mostly in impoverished nations, that would tell stories of having, in essence, turned over all their money to somebody that they were in a relationship with. They thought was me. They didn't, you know, a person by a different name. And when you deal with that, and particularly across international lines, it's obviously tough to track some of these folks down. And you just realize how often people are manipulating, you know, folks using that disinformation. By the way, I want to say too, I think part of the reason this has accelerated so much, and I know the vaccine question was asked as well, you know, in the United States particularly, it's interesting, the anti-vax movement kind of started on the left, and now it actually has exploded on the right, which goes to show that, you know, with misinformation, the extremes of both sides, in essence, can be pretty close to the same. But I think it happened when it came to COVID lockdowns, and all of a sudden, you know, people find themselves with plenty of time. They're at home, and what do? They're going to watch television. In some cases, you know, the most extreme news channels, for instance, but they're going to spend a whole lot of time online. And when you're spending time online, searching, and these search results are drawing you in. You know, we saw in Netflix, there was the Social Dilemma show that I would encourage anybody to watch. It talked about a lady that, you know, joined a group to make organic kids food, and she ends up being recommended an anti-vaxxer site. And so those are the things that we have to get a real grip on, is understand that, look, we want freedom of business, right? We cannot hold these social media companies 100%, you know, reliable for everything that happens. It's like charging somebody that owns a private property for a crime that happens there. But there has got to be government and private sector and allies stepping up to say, this is now a real threat to the stability of democracy. That's what we've seen, both with misinformation, with, you know, taking people for all they're worth through scams, but importantly through state actors with a low barrier of entry coming in and trying to take down democracies.
Yeah, we've seen it at GMF. We've been studying this, and we've seen that those various groups fed into each other with increasing extremism happening. So you go online to look up, you know, ADHD, and the next thing you know, you're anti-vax, and then flat Earth, and so on. But so why don't I go to Bruce then, since we're talking about vaccines, because you've held a number of important roles in the public health world. Can you tell us about some of the different efforts that are either nascent or have been tried over a period of time in this space?
Well, again, go back to the minister's story with her child. In those days, it was trying to have people ask questions of the doctor, because the doctor was a trusted source. Now people get information from all types of places, and it's going to be important they be able to find a trusted source of good information. So the trick is to make sure that we can translate the science so people can understand it, and find those people at a community level who are going to be the translators and those trusted sources. I think the concept that somebody raised is the civilian first responders of information. How do we have a cadre of people who can be those translators to the people in our community, whether it's health, climate, hate, you pick your topic. To me, that's what's so interesting about this conversation, is that we're all seeing the harms come to our different sectors. The methods are similar, and we should be able to think of similar methods to try to counter those harms.
Yeah, that's very true. And Assistant Secretary General, maybe you can talk a little bit about what NATO has seen in terms of foreign interference and what lessons it's learned and applied elsewhere. I know that you have this StratCom Center of Excellence and you do listening, and so maybe you can talk about some of the specific strategies and what you've seen.
Thank you very much, and good to see you, Ambassador Kornblum. And let me say that for NATO, countering disinformation or hostile information or subversive actions is nothing new. Since NATO was established, it has been happening to us as an institution. So we are just very well tuned in to know what to do, and we are using full scale of our own instruments, and it's called strategic communications, to tell our story, to basically fulfill our tasks. Having said that, again, with technology and EDTs, the emerging disruptive technologies, we depend more and more on the stability of democratic institutions and the trust, just as Dr. Göttlin said, trust into the sources, credible sources of information, but also on the channels of distribution, so the networks, but also on our own audiences, educated, knowledgeable audiences. So when we look and try to separate and understand how they influence each other, all the three elements are very important. And if our democratic governments are doing really a lot, both on sources and in terms of audiences, getting, you know, our society groups much more aware, our citizens much more aware on a variety of external threats and foreign threats and issues related to that, then on networks and on channels, we very much depend on the private sector. And the private sector really, really has to come in to play a much more important role, just as our representative Kissinger said, that indeed the algorithms, the very business models that we have seen, and there again, NATO is not a regulatory organization, so we cannot really regulate ourselves anything. So we depend on allies, and it would be good for allies to talk to each other and find the way how to bring together the security need of our societies, for 1 billion societies that we depend on and to be able to protect, while guaranteeing these basic rights, but in the same time not undermining the security. And the private sector has to be in it and on it fully.
Yeah, I hear a few themes about, you know, respecting freedom of expression, whole of society, transparency, educating people about what they're seeing. But we only have a couple of minutes left, unfortunately. I think this has been a really rich conversation despite all our technical issues, so I'm very grateful. Just very quickly, maybe we can go around and just talk about the future. And I want to start with Minister. You know, what's next in your sphere, and then also how can we learn from the experiments that everyone is trying and build on them, so that, because this is a problem that reaches across all these different spheres, and we don't want to each be addressing them on our own. So, Minister, if you don't mind, and I know that you've spoken out on vaccines too. I think you spoke at a G7 summit on vaccines. Where do you see this battle against online harms going?
Thank you. Very briefly from me, I think, you know, there is no single solution to this. It's a hellishly complex challenge. We've got to use the full range of tools at our disposal. And that includes, yes, regulation, really important collaboration with industry and with other partners, really important to work internationally because, you know, the threat is such a global threat. And, you know, and it also means developing media literacy, giving people, you know, our population the tools to be able to be more discerning users of the online world and to understand mis and disinformation where they see it. You know, and given the scale of the problem and the borderless nature of the online environment, this has to be a whole of society response. It has to be a response which requires huge international collaboration. And that's where things like the work that I announced at the G7 summit, which is basically an effectiveness framework. It explores the types of information that would help us better understand the effects of changes to platform policies and interfaces, really just trying to figure out what it is that works so that we can do more of it and better in the future.
That's such a great initiative, and I think we need, you know, we certainly need to have more transparency into what's happening online, what the platforms are doing across our countries, as well as across these silos. Congressman, I know you've talked a lot about the damage of algorithms. You've introduced legislation. Where do you see things going in the U.S.?
We're going to continue to have these divided times in the United States, and but I think this is one area we can certainly, you know, come together around. To use that British colloquialism I just heard, hellishly complex. I like it. I'm going to start using that. No, it is very complex. I think a couple things need to happen. The most important thing, yes, there needs to be some government action. I don't know what that action we can get through, but secondarily, people have to be aware for their own hearts and their own heads. You have to understand that if you want to be misled on the internet, you can be, right? But that's not anything to be proud of. Don't join your tribe. No truth. You are responsible for truth. And I think taking personal accountability for that and not looking for the government to solve all your problems, because this is exactly why we're different. than Russia and China, for instance, is because we recognize that government protects you. It's not coming in to micromanage and solve all your little challenges. You have to take responsibility. But on a government side, I will say too, I think we need to engage in rules of the road for how to go after state actors pressing misinformation. And by the way, that may include some offensive operations as well on our end. If you think about, for instance, what is it that ever prevented a nuclear exchange? It was the reality that both, in essence, two sides can play that game. And until we can get a grip on what's happening, the deterioration of our societies that's occurring, this division that's being fed in some cases by Iran, Russia, the CCP, they need to understand that we in the West are willing to play that game too, and we don't want to, but we need to understand that this is very serious to the future of society, and I think pull out whatever stops we can.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to give 20 seconds, unfortunately, to the Secretary General and to Bruce to wrap up.
I think we have to recognize that we will never be in a perfect place. It will be constantly moving field. So investing in our own people, in our own knowledge, in our own skills, in our technologies, and really, again, whole society, whole government approach across the civilian and military. Because at the end, there is a lot that starts abroad, but through the information, we clearly see it comes through the tiers, and there are local actors distributing the hostile information, disinformation, not even speaking about misinformation, which is without hostile intent. So very clearly, we as governments, we as credible actors, as private sector, we really need to invest in all the spheres. And that includes media literacy for our citizens. That includes also in public media, public sector, broadcasters, in other credible sources of information, but also in our own trusted communications. And this is what NATO does. We invest very much to make sure that our story is heard into our audiences, by our partners, but also by our adversaries, that they know that NATO is serious about what we do.
Thank you. And Bruce, you just started at Rockefeller. So tell us, what do you think, what do you hope to do? What can we do next on the anti-vax?
Well, I think it applies across the sectors. And I think to underscore what everyone else has said, but also I think we also need to know how to measure things. To learn lessons, we need to know what impact they're having, and that's not so easy. So I think as we get into this, to have some of those metrics, to know that what we're trying works or doesn't work or backfires, so we can then inform each other how to do that. And then finally, I think the metaphor today was we need to get out of our echo chambers and be able to talk to people in different spheres.
Thank you so much. Apologies for the technical issues. Very much appreciate it.